Dorian Kramer here again. So today we are going to work on our understanding of more of our trauma. But we're going to do this from the perspective of understanding how our body responds under stress. And we're also going to look at aspects of Chinese medicine. So, at its basic level, what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma is we are talking about the fight or flight response. And we're going to actually backpedal just a little bit. So first I want to talk about, we've all heard of PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we now have CPTSD, which is chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we have now something called DTD, developmental trauma disorder. Primarily what we're going to be talking about is this area, CPTSD and DTD. PTSD is when we have a single event. PTSD is when we have a single event. Sorry, someone just walked in. Or two events. Chronic PTSD is generally when we have more than two events, and we're often talking about from a younger age on. Developmental trauma disorders, very specifically with what we talked about last time, the ACE study, and that this is what happens when multiple traumas happen in childhood and the consequences of that. Okay, so how our fight or flight response works. We're going to go through some basics here. We have to understand that our body is really well designed to handle stress. The kind of stress that we're talking about is when we're talking about acute stress or acute stress that may last for a while. So the idea of a lion is now chasing me. I have to fight it, run from it, or perhaps curl up and deal with a small attack while it gets bored and walks away. My body is well designed for that. My fight or flight response kicks in, I run fast, I get away, or I fight it off, I'm good. Okay, let's say more of a prolonged aspect. The prolonged aspect is when perhaps as a farmer, I've had crop failure. And those crops have failed, and now I'm looking at a period of starvation, monetary loss. But it's going to happen for a short period, maybe 3 to 4 months. Eventually I'll get out of it. My body is well designed to handle that. There may be some consequences of a 3 to 4 month period of high stress, some periods of starvation, money loss, but overall, still well designed. This third level is where we're not so well designed to handle, and that's this chronic prolonged stress. And often this chronic prolonged stress is not physical, it's mental. And what I mean by this stress is that it's not only the outside stressor. So that mental stress may be, I'm worried about finances, I'm worried about the economy, I'm worried about taxes, I'm worried about who's president, I'm worried about keeping my guns or keeping my religion or keeping my sexuality. I'm worried about Facebook arguments. I'm worried about all these other things that are constantly there. It's not necessarily those things that are the problem. It's how I'm responding to it and my internal makeup and how that prolongs this effect. And that's where our body has issues. That's where we tend to fail. Okay, so at its base level, the fight or flight response is designed to do what? It's designed to keep you alive. You run or you fight. So, in order to have that happen, certain things have to happen in our body. So, some of those may be that our blood pressure needs to elevate. So the blood pressure goes up in order to speed up the flow of blood through the vessels so that we can fight or we can run. My blood sugar has to go up. Right? I'm going to need energy for this fight. So now my blood sugar goes up, my body starts ripping all through my storages, releases glucose into the system. Insulin at the same time has to jack up through the roof so that I can utilize this glucose and get it into the cells. Okay, what else happens? Well, my heart rate has to go up, right? I need that blood pumping as fast as I can so I can fight. Okay, so now my heart rate's rapid. My blood pressure's through the roof. We've all heard of cortisol. People often talk about cortisol as a stress hormone, and it is. But why is it produced? So cortisol goes up. You can see from here, yeah. Okay, cortisol. Cortisol is also one of the most powerful anti-inflammatories our body produces. Why is it producing this? I'm about to get into a fight, or I'm going to have to run. I'm going to need to manage pain and injury. So now cortisol is elevated. Okay, but cortisol needs to be produced. My body uses the precursor to cortisol is cholesterol. So my cholesterol goes up. Now, at the same time, cortisol has a specific effect on T4. So my thyroid goes down, right? None of this is abnormal. These aren't diseases. This is how my body is designed to function. My blood pressure goes up, my blood sugar goes up, my heart rate goes up, my cortisol and cholesterol go up, my thyroid function goes down, my muscles in my thoracic region and my lumbar region start contracting. They contract in order to strengthen that area, but also because the fight or flight response comes out into the body through the thoracic and the lumbar region. By doing that, it causes the muscles to be tenser but stronger and ready to act. Now, at the same time, in order to have all of this happen, my body has to shunt a little bit. Oh, as well, in the brain, one of the areas we talk about is the prefrontal cortex. This is where thought happens. Look at that more to the front part of the brain. That's my lovely drawing of a brain, right? Instead of going here to where rational thought happens, I'm going to actually shunt more of my work here to the amygdala area and more basal areas of the brain, because right now I don't need to think. I don't need to do math problems. I need to get away from this lion, right? So my ability to actually make more rational decisions goes down because I don't need to. This is a survival mechanism. Survival mechanisms work better without my thoughts interfering with them, right? Okay. So as well now, I'm gonna need to shunt stuff because I want more stuff, more blood flow going to my heart and my lungs. So what happens? Instead, my internal organs like my kidneys, my liver, my stomach, my spleen, my pancreas, all those nice ones in there that help with digestion, all these life functions, blood flow goes down. Blood flow goes down because I don't need those right now. I need to survive. Okay, this happens for 10 minutes, not bad. A more minor version of this happens for 3 or 4 months. Not great, but still not so bad. Now, let's look at what this picture is. If we're talking long term, right? Long term, this is really bad. My blood pressure stays elevated. By the way, this, if we understand a Western terminology, it's called metabolic syndrome, right? So my blood sugar goes up. My blood sugar stays up long enough. My cells become insulin resistant because they're tired of the insulin knocking on the door. So now my blood sugar not only is elevated from the stress, but it won't go into the cells anymore, or a number of the cells, because of the chronic stress and the chronic exposure. My heart rate is staying elevated. And against this high blood pressure, now I'm creating issues with my heart because it's fighting the blood pressure to keep the heart rate up. And that's going to eventually lead to things like left ventricular hypertrophy. My ability to think goes down. I start processing things more into basal levels of the brain, so I process things more emotionally. I process chronic pain there as well. This becomes a bad cycle. Remember this whole area here, which is this weird circle I drew? This area is all my digestive system. And all of that starts being impacted. It's just not working as well. It's not designed to work as well. At the same time, my cholesterol stays elevated. My cholesterol's up, my cortisol's up, and eventually my cortisol goes up too much and then it starts to plummet downwards. We'll get into that in some of our later discussions. And my thyroid stays chronically low. Now, my survival mechanisms what's killing me. Right? Okay. Let's get to some basic ideas about childhood, and then we'll get to some understanding of Chinese medicine, and then we'll probably call it a day. Okay? So, we're going to talk about childhood. We're not going to talk about something called transgenerational trauma. We'll get into that later on. Transgenerational trauma is the idea that you can actually create something similar to what we consider genetics within the space of a generation or two. So trauma that you experience as an adult can actually affect your unborn child. That can lead to 3 generations of trauma. What we're talking about is the basic foundations of our development as children. When we are children, we are developing our understanding of the world, our understanding of the safety of the world. So, if for the most part your childhood is pretty good, then your understanding of the world is relatively a safe place. So when you experience these small dangers, you understand that they're transient. But for a child who has developed developmental trauma disorder, or if you want to just say has experienced trauma early on in life, and that trauma has been relatively consistent, or has it happened for a long enough period of time, then the child associates the universe with that. That means that every time we experience a new trauma, that trauma is more likely to be considered long-term. We will respond as though that trauma is long-term. So essentially, the child understands the world as a bad, unsafe place, that good is transient, bad is more long-term. So that child, all that cascade of effects that we showed, they're gonna live like that on a day-to-day basis with lower mental function, higher blood pressure, higher heart rate, more trauma, less digestive ability. Long-term, obviously this would lead to disease processes, even in an adult. When we're young enough, our bodies can compensate for that. As we get older, it's harder and harder to compensate. And that's why we see that deterioration. That's why we see people with these patterns of the ACEs or the DTD having series of chronic illnesses that never seem to resolve. Okay, so that's the basics in childhood. Now let's talk about Chinese medicine a little bit. Within Chinese medicine, we talk about different organs and different channels. And you don't have to get too caught up in the idea that these names refer to the specific organs. What we're going to talk about is the liver organ, spleen, kidney, and heart, and lung. In Chinese medicine, we believe that there are specific emotions associated with each one of these organs, and those emotions have a base effect on the health of the organ, or the health of the organ and channel can affect the emotion. So an excess of the emotion either damages the organ and channel, or the damaged organ and channel creates an excess of the emotion, and then becomes a cyclical relationship. So for the liver, it's anger. For the spleen, it's thinking or overthinking, and that can eventually lead to things like anxiety. For the kidney, it's fear. For the heart, it's joy. For the lung, it's sadness, and sometimes people describe that as grief. Okay. Quite often, we also have to look at how the liver and the other channels interact. So, besides these emotional states, what we have is we have an idea of the liver has a controlling function. So let's backstep. Actually, let's see, can you see me over here? Okay, so we have 2 cycles that we're looking at. We're looking at what we call the engendering cycle, which is the idea that each channel or organ supports another one. So the kidney is the water channel. So water creates wood, and that's the liver. Wood creates fire, and that's the heart. Fire creates earth, which is the spleen. By the way, some people think that it's a mistranslation and it was they were talking about the pancreas. And earth creates metal, and then metal, which is the lung, goes back and creates water. Okay? Now we have to look at this idea of the controlling cycle and its effect. There's a controlling cycle in which wood controls earth, earth controls water, water controls fire, fire controls metal, and metal goes back and controls wood. Okay, so using these concepts and these, what are we talking about? Well, in Chinese medicine, there's an idea that the liver, when there's too much anger, and anger actually comes from fear, right? Fear related to water, to wood. So the fear in the water creates more anger in the wood. So anger in Chinese medicine is also an idea of this yang energy. We call it rising up. One of the signs of yang energy rising up is often high blood pressure or hypertension, right? So now we're seeing one component of that idea that we talked about before, right? Blood pressure has to go up under danger, and the blood pressure stays elevated. Okay. When this rises up, one of the things they say is that the yang rises up and hits the heart with heat, and that heat increases the heart rate. Okay? As well, what we have is the liver, they say, when it's damaged, it acts excess, and then it over-controls this earth, right? So here's our spleen. Over-controlling it actually damages the ability to think, but also, remember those digestive issues? Remember how the organs would shut down? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about that stress shutting down function of the digestive component. And the spleen, or the earth element, kind of controls all of that. Now, what else happens? Well, we talked about blood sugar going up. Blood sugar falls under this digestive area as well often. And what they say is that the spleen, let me erase some of this so it doesn't get so confusing. The spleen in Chinese medicine is responsible for what they call transformation and transportation. Transformation and transportation in Chinese medicine often has to do with how food and fluids are transformed in order for us to use them. When the spleen is impaired, it creates more damp. That fluid in the body eventually congeals. That congelation turns into what we call phlegm. One of the modern ideas of phlegm is cholesterol. So now we have that high cholesterol that we talked about, right? So the high blood pressure coming from the liver impacts the spleen. This creates the high blood sugar, the high cholesterol. It interferes with the basic digestive ability. The heat or yang energy of the liver, as it rises up and creates the hypertension, also affects the heart and the heart rate. Back to the spleen also controls the basic metabolism of the body, which we know our thyroid has a strong effect on. So now the metabolism goes down. In addition, what we say is fear, chronic fear, damages the lower back, which damages the whole back by going through the kidney. So that chronic fear affects the kidney as well. So the kidney, now we have lower back issues. They also say the clear yang of the spleen rises up to the head and clears the clouds. Part of that is what we're talking about, is the ability to think, and also this comes from the kidney as well. So now what are we dealing with? We're dealing with the ability to think. We're dealing with that issue with the prefrontal cortex, and now it's being shunted to the amygdala. Okay. So those are some of the basic ideas in Chinese medicine and what we're talking about with stress. In our next discussion, what we're going to get into is actually more how the glucocorticoids in the body function and how that translates to Chinese medicine, and how the function of those various glucocorticoids and glucosteroids in the body affect our overall health. We're getting into specifics of autoimmune diseases, we'll get into specifics of high blood pressure, diabetes, and psychiatric disorders, and then we'll start to get into how we can treat those, okay? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.